red and blue in your mirror. You pull over, wind the window down, license already in your hand. The officer gets out, walks up the driver's side, and just before he reaches your window, he does it. 2 knuckles, tap tap, right on the tail light. You've seen this clip online a dozen times. Someone in the comments always says the same thing. He's leaving a fingerprint, in case something happens to him, in case you drive off. It's a good story. It's also an American story, and it's about to matter that you know the difference. Here's what nobody selling you that clip tells you. Search every Australian police training document, every state parliament record, every court transcript that exists, and the tail light tap is nowhere in them. Not once. It comes from American police academies, built around American case law, filmed on American dash cams, and reposted onto Australian feeds, where the comment section assumes it traveled with the accent. It didn't. And the reason that matters isn't the tap itself. It's what happens in the 90 seconds after it, because that part is real, it is Australian, and it is where drivers actually get themselves into trouble. By the end of this video, you'll have one sentence, 5 words long, that satisfies everything the law actually requires of you at that window and gives up nothing it doesn't. And a warning about the one version of this stop where that sentence isn't enough on its own, because there is one, and pretending there isn't would be doing you a disservice. Quick word before we get into it. No invented authority on this channel. Just plain English Australian law, checked against the actual statutes, every section sitting in the description below. Let's be fair to the officer for a second, because most of them aren't running a script on you. They're doing a job that puts them at genuine risk every single shift. That's exactly why it's worth knowing precisely where their power starts and where it stops. Because they know. You should too. First, the part of the American myth worth taking seriously, even though the practice itself isn't. The tail light tap exists where it exists, because a traffic stop is one of the most dangerous 10 minutes in policing. That danger is real here too. What's different is what the officer is legally entitled to do about it once he reaches your window, and that's where Australian law and American law split completely, in a way that actually changes what you should say out loud. In New South Wales, under Section 175 of the Road Transport Act, you produce your license. Under Section 11 of LEPRA, if the officer holds a specific articulable suspicion, not a hunch, a reason, he can require your name and address, and refusing without a reasonable excuse carries a fine around $220 under Section 12. Victoria runs the same duty through Section 456AA of the Crimes Act. Queensland through Sections 40 and 41 of the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act. That's the compelled half of the stop. It exists, it's enforceable, and no clever phrase erases it. Every one of those sections was written for a simple reason. An officer standing at a car window in the dark needs a fast, reliable way to know who he's talking to. That purpose is legitimate, and giving your name and license when it's asked for isn't a concession. It's the part of the exchange the law was always going to require. But that's where the compelled half ends. Everything past your name, your address, and your license, where you're coming from, where you're going, what you were doing tonight, sits on the other side of the line. And the courts have already drawn that line for you, twice, in 2 different states, decades apart. Melbourne, DPP versus CBA. A passenger, not even the driver, is asked his name 3 times after a routine stop, then arrested for refusing to explain where he'd been. It goes to the Supreme Court of Victoria. Justice Bell rules the stop itself was lawful, but the questioning that followed it wasn't. Past identity, the judge wrote, where you've been and what you were doing is your private business. That sentence is doing the same job in your driveway that it did in that courtroom. The second case matters because it shows the same principle from the other direction. What happens when a driver gets the compelled half wrong instead of the voluntary half? A driver stopped in New South Wales who announces he doesn't consent to identifying himself hasn't found a clever loophole. He's manufactured a second charge that didn't need to exist, on top of whatever the stop was originally about. The courts have never rewarded that move, and no version of the sentence in this video asks you to try it. The two halves of the stop aren't equal, and treating them as if they were is the single fastest way to turn a 2-minute check into a much longer night. Now the mistakes almost everyone makes, and none of them have anything to do with taillights. Error 1. Treating every question at the window as if it were compelled. It isn't. Only identity is, and only when there's a real trigger behind it. The driver who answers, "Where are you coming from?" the same way he answers, "Can I see your license?" has just handed over information the law never asked him to give on a body-worn camera permanently. Error 2. Over-explaining. The driver who fills a pause with detail nobody asked for. "I was just at my mate's place. We had a couple of beers, not many though, I'm fine to drive," has built a timeline in his own voice that didn't exist 30 seconds earlier. Silence doesn't need filling. A pause is not evidence of anything. Error 3. Refusing the wrong thing. The driver who gets defensive about handing over his license, who wants to argue the compelled half instead of simply complying with it, has just manufactured an offense that didn't exist 30 seconds earlier. Refusing to answer an optional question is not, on its own, reasonable suspicion of anything. That's the standard the courts set in Rondo and in Street v. Bauer. Suspicion needs a factual basis, something more than a possibility, and a declined question is not a fact against you. But refusing a compelled request is a real charge every time, with a real fine attached to it. Error 4, and this one catches people who think they've done everything right. Answering for someone else in the car. A driver who jumps in to confirm or correct a passenger's account has just built a timeline for two people at once, on the strength of a question neither of them owed an answer to. Nobody in that car has a legal duty to make their stories match, because neither of them owed a story in the first place. Now, an honest word about the edge of this, because a channel that only tells you the parts that make you feel safe isn't actually protecting you. Nervousness on its own can't become reasonable suspicion. Refusal on its own can't either. But nervousness plus something concrete, bloodshot eyes, an obvious smell in the car, something the officer can point to and name, that combination can be enough, as a Queensland court found in Swain. So the sentence you're about to learn isn't a shield against every possible outcome of the stop. It's the thing that keeps a routine check routine, by giving the compelled half in full and declining the voluntary half calmly, with nothing extra riding along on the tone. So here's the sentence that keeps both halves correct, said once, calm, unhurried. "Here's my license, officer. I'd rather not get into where I've been." Say it again, slower, because the second pass is the one that actually stays with you. "Here's my license, officer. I'd rather not get into where I've been." Every word in that sentence is doing a job. "Here's my license" satisfies Section 175, Section 11, Section 456 AA, Section 40 as, the whole compelled list in 5 words with nothing left to charge. "I'd rather not get into where I've been" declines the voluntary half, cleanly, without an argument attached to it. No statute in any eastern state compels a movement answer, and Justice Bell already told you why. Past your identity, that's private business. The tone carries the other half of the job. Warm, brief, final. Nothing for a notebook to write down as uncooperative. Now the moment the tail light tap actually points to, once you strip the myth away. The tap, real or not, exists to buy the officer a few seconds of information before he reaches your window. Is anything moving inside the car? Is anyone reaching for something? Is the boot properly shut? It's not evidence of anything about you. It's not a signal you did something wrong. Don't read meaning into it. And don't let it rattle you into talking more than the law requires the moment he arrives at your window. The trained officer has two ways to push on that sentence once you've said it, and both of them are already answered before he says them. Push 1, where's sympathy? Nothing to hide, is there? Why not just tell me? You don't reach for an explanation. Same words, same tone. Here's my license, officer. I'd rather not get into where I've been. Push 2, where's consequence? Being difficult is only going to make this take longer for you. It won't, and the sentence doesn't bargain with the threat. Same sentence again. By the third time you've heard it in your own head, it's muscle, not memory, which is exactly the point of saying it out loud twice right now, before you ever need it on the road. Picture the whole stop, start to finish. Blue lights. You're already pulled over, window down, license in hand before he's out of the car. He walks up, taps the tail light out of habit. Plenty of officers do it without knowing why, the same way you might tap a steering wheel at a red light. He reaches the window. Evening, where are you coming from tonight? You, calm, license already extended. Here's my license, officer. I'd rather not get into where I've been. He checks it. Nothing outstanding. No worries, on your way. Window up. Nothing in that exchange was defiance. You gave the law everything it was owed and kept the one thing it never asked for. Now the version where it doesn't end that quickly, because pretending every stop plays out that clean would be doing you a disservice. Same stop, same opening line. This time, instead of moving on, the officer leans in slightly. Come on, it's just a question, mate. Where were you tonight? You don't escalate, and you don't repeat yourself louder. Same words, same level. Here's my license, officer. I'd rather not get into where I've been. A pause. He looks at the license again, checks it against the system. If he names a real reason at this point, I'm requiring your details under Section 11. I suspect you can assist with an investigation. That's a different moment. Your identity has just become compellable in full, and you give it, because now it's law, not a fishing question. You still decline the movements, but you don't argue the identity once it's properly grounded, because that argument was never yours to win. If instead he says nothing further, gives your license back, and waves you on, that's the far more common ending, and it looks exactly like the clean version above. The sentence did its job either way. It never depended on the officer's mood to hold. A word specifically for whoever's sitting next to you, because the passenger seat isn't a neutral place to be during any of this. If there's a second person in the car and the officer's attention drifts toward them, and where were you two coming from? The same line applies, with the same limits. A passenger only has to identify themselves when there's a genuine trigger tied to them specifically, not simply because they happen to be sitting in the front seat of a car that got pulled over. Remember the case from earlier? The man in DPP versus CBA was a passenger, not the driver, and the demand made of him was the exact thing the Supreme Court struck down. If the officer asks the passenger the same movement question, the same 5-word structure works just as well from that seat. Happy to give my details if needed, officer. I'd rather not get into where we've been. Two people in a car are allowed to decline the same optional question without it looking like they're hiding something from each other. It isn't obstruction, and it isn't collusion. It's two people who don't owe the same story simply because they're sitting in the same vehicle. One more piece worth carrying with you because it changes what you do after the window goes back up, not during. If anything about the stop felt like it went further than a routine check, a search happened, you were asked to step out for reasons that were never named, the tone shifted in a way you couldn't account for, write it down that night. Time, location, what was said, whether there were other officers present, not because you're building a case in the moment, because 2 weeks later, when the details matter, you won't remember them with the same precision you have right now. There's a broader point sitting underneath all of this that's worth naming directly, because it's the reason the taillight myth spreads as easily as it does. People fill gaps in their understanding of the law with whatever explanation is available, and a dramatic one travels faster than an accurate one. That's true of the fingerprint story, and it's just as true of half the advice circulating about what you supposedly have to say at a traffic stop. The corrective isn't a longer list of things to memorize. It's understanding the one distinction underneath all of it. Identity is owed, movement is not, and letting that distinction answer every version of the question an officer might ask, whether it's about your night, your passenger, or the tap on your taillight that started this whole conversation. And a genuine state-by-state note, because this channel doesn't pretend one set of numbers covers the country. What you've heard tonight reflects New South Wales, with Victoria and Queensland marked at the relevant sections. South Australia, Western Australia, Tasmania, the Northern Territory, and the ACT each run their own identity trigger provisions, and they're not identical to the 3 states covered here. If you're driving somewhere else, the 5-word sentence still holds: identity given, movements declined, but check the specific section for your state before you assume the fine amounts match. To close it out, the tail light tap is a story that belongs to American policing, not Australian law, and copying an American script onto an Australian stop is exactly how drivers talk themselves into trouble they didn't need. What actually matters at that window is simple: your identity and your license. Give them every time, no argument. Your evening, that's yours to keep. And the sentence that holds that line stays the same no matter what the officer's hands are doing on the way up, no matter how many times he pushes on it, and no matter which state you're standing in. Here's my license, officer. I'd rather not get into where I've been. This is general information, not legal advice, and the section numbers change at every state border. Check the ones that apply where you actually drive. If a stop goes further than a conversation, the video ends and a lawyer begins. Legal aid exists in every state. Share this with the person who's shown you that tail light clip and sworn it happens here. Share it with the one who's never known what to say when the questions go past, "Where are you coming from?" And tell me in the comments, have you ever had an officer tap your tail light? And did you always wonder why? Subscribe for the next stop, because next time, it isn't your taillight they're asking about. It's the phone in your pocket. That video's coming next.